Il est 5 heures. Sur la radio parfaite, en partenariat avec webSYNradio, c'est l'éveil du son. Avec une programmation de JanEK SCHAEFER pour le Printemps des Arts de Monte Carlo.
Imagine our world, where nature only cares about one kind of intelligence, the intelligence that would enable us to look at the consequences of the way we are living, and judge which characteristics are detrimental to our own survival prospects, and then change our behavior accordingly. If we can do that, then nature will judge us to be an intelligent species. If we can't, then are we really any more intelligent than an organism like yeast, which would be behaving in exactly the same way in its own habitat? In a cocktail glass of fruit juice, for example, the yeast eats up the sugar, consuming their energy source, while producing carbon dioxide and polluting their environment with alcohol. In the last 50 years we have enjoyed the biggest party in the history of the world, as a direct result of discovering cheap energy. We are living in the happy hour of our evolution. Each liter of crude oil is equivalent to about 5 weeks of human hard labor. The current generation will have consumed around half of the world's non-renewable resources in their lifetime. That is a stunning fact, and our demand for more and more and more and more and more is exponential. It is predicted that all the raw mineral mines on Earth will be exhausted by the end of this century. We have come to believe that growth is the only reality. Modern economic theory looks at the environment as being a subset of the economy, which can always grow bigger and bigger and bigger. Of course, the reality of the situation is the exact opposite, as the human economy is a subset of the environment. And if the environment falters, then the economy can't continue to grow. Are we happier now that we have everything we could ever desire delivered at the click of a mouse? Numerous studies have concluded that there is very little correlation between prosperity and happiness. We could again be happy with less if we plan ahead. It is worth bearing in mind that in just 1 hour, the sun sends Earth enough energy to power the whole of humanity for 1 year. There really is no excuse for us to blindly continue as if this goes on forever. As we approach a state of ecstatic entropy, at the very peak of the party on this planet, are we actually any more intelligent than yeast? Humans will do anything to survive. Optimism is our innate state of mind. Will it all just work out for the best, in the end?
The most important thing is really that people will do anything to survive. Survival is not just a matter of physical survival, of getting food, keeping warm. Survival is mental, it's in the head, and that people will believe anything to survive.
To be.
Well, you want to know the real reason we went to war in Iraq? According to former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, it's simple, three-letter answer, not WMD, it's OIL.
I am saddened that it's politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows, that the Iraq War is largely about oil.
You might read the ex-chairman of Shell that said over the weekend that oil could hit over $150 a barrel as world production begins to peak. Not really good news for a country whose entire economy, not to mention its entire way of life, is based on cheap oil.
What they have done.
It was sort of too selfish to really, it was about me wanting to see things, and it wasn't, certainly me first, and secondary to that was...
We've got another result coming in now from Tooting.
sur des quais.
It seems to me that the sort of world we live in needs a certain amount of oil to make the wheels go round. Now, certainly the landscape, the media landscape that we inhabit, this enormous novel we're living inside, thrives on sensation. It needs sensation to sustain itself. We're rather in the position of a sort of drowsing animal drugged by some powerful narcotic agent who needs electric shocks to keep it awake.
webRadio du Printemps des Arts de Monte Carlo vous propose une programmation exclusive de JanEK SCHAEFER en partenariat avec webSYNradio.
Hi, this is JanEK here. You're listening to the in-car radio. And this whole journey that you're sitting in front of, being part of, began for me when I was a child. My father was an ecological physicist, so he was doing research into ecologically sustainable methods of crop control and locust control. And this year, he would have been 80, and I'm 40 this year, and my daughter's 4. There's all these magic numbers, and when I'm researching all the information I'm trying to pass on to you, I was thinking, well, really, what is my daughter's life going to be like in 40 years when she's 40? And as part of that journey, she just got into this amazing new primary school where I live in Walton-on-Thames, and I was looking it up, and I saw that the headmaster had done some incredible things towards sustainability, and he's had an inspirational story himself. So I'm sat here in the headmaster's office, and you join me with Richard Dunn. Hello, Richard.
Hello, JanEK.
I'd like to know about your story, because I think it's emblematic of what we can all achieve if we are positive.
I met a man called Robert Swan, who is a polar explorer, and every year takes a team of people from all over the world to Antarctica to be inspired by the raw beauty of it and to understand that it's changing very dramatically. So I went with his expedition 3 years ago and saw firsthand the just incredible beauty and the silence of Antarctica. It's a pretty wild place, and came back, very privileged to have gone, and came back and thought, we need to do something back in this community, in this school, that addresses the real issue of Antarctica's change. Climate change, it's a political hot potato, but actually for me it's a reality, and it's part of our living unsustainably. So I came back here to school and spoke with the governors, with the staff, and ultimately with the children, and said, we need to do something about this. We need to change the way we run this school, because climate change fundamentally is about energy and energy use. So over the last 2.5 to 3 years, we've just gone through a process of changing our behaviour and now changing our culture. So what perhaps 3 years ago was very normal practice, using a lot of energy, not really thinking about it, keeping lights on, leaving things on, being very unaware, is now very unusual to see in this school. People are very conscious of how they use energy, and the way that we use our energy system in terms of targets, in terms of getting the children to analyse our data and understand where we can get even better, has been key to that. So it's been quite a journey, and it's been really exciting. And for me, it highlights that, people go, oh, it's very uptight being sustainable and it's a bit of an eco-warrior thing. It's not that at all. It's just about doing things really well and doing things better.
It's very empowering, isn't it?
Hugely, yeah. And I think, I know you're talking to me today, but actually the biggest ambassadors of all this work are the children. And we take our oldest children to Chamonix in the Alps by train, and we get them to experience climate change for real, rather like I went to Antarctica, by touching the glaciers, seeing them melt on their hands, and understanding that these glaciers are shrinking because of the way we are using energy and polluting as a result of that. So yeah, it's about at every stage getting them to, firstly, to connect, to have experiences that make them love their world, and then as they get a bit older, to say to them, okay, you love this world, but hang on a minute, there are things here that are not working very well, and we can do something about that. And that's the empowerment.
That's brilliant. What did you, I understand within the first year you managed to reduce the energy reduction in the school by half?
Yeah, we did. We started monitoring, and as I said before, monitoring and measuring our energy has been so core to what we do. And then through the monitoring, we started to refine our efficiency practice, changing our lighting, double glazing units in classrooms, that sort of thing. And the icing on the cake really was to start to introduce renewable energy technologies. And as we know, it's a big cost, but if you can find the grants, if you can get the support, and now with feed-in tariffs, if you can get the initial outlay there, it is worth doing. So that process led to us reducing our electricity specifically by 51% in the first year. And we've just continued to refine our practice. So in the second year it was another 24%. And this year, so that's 75 in 2 years, this year I think we're still down again by another 12 to 15%. So at the moment we're in June, so it's the best time of year, long light days. We're running the school when it's good weather on virtually nothing.
I know, I heard that you ran the whole school off the national grid for 1 or 2 weeks a while ago or now. Or,
Yeah, I mean, certainly part of that process is to do what we call shutdown. So when we're here, obviously we need to use electricity to enable us to run laptops, computers, whatever. So we do use a small amount, but usually on a good day, sunny day, we can cover that demand through our solar photovoltaics. But when we're not here, we shut down completely. So we literally turn everything off. I think the only 2 things that are still on are the server, which we keep on in case people need to come in and pick up emails and things, and the fish tank. But apart from that, we're on zero.
When I first came to see you, I'd said, have you heard of 1010, the 1010 initiative? And your answer was wonderful, because you reached into your collar and you pulled out your 1010 tag, and you said that you were the lead school. What kind of school are you?
Well, we're the case study school for 1010, which means that when 1010 was launched, we were asked to come and share our practice. And in fact, the 1010 10-point plan for schools is something that is based on this practice in this school. Even in a school like this, where I think our profile in terms of sustainability, in terms of energy conservation, is very high, we are still always trying to see how we can engage people more and more. Some people are committed, but there are plenty who, for whatever reason, maybe they're just really busy, maybe it doesn't really matter to them, are not engaged in the same way.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your fantastic work. And listen to him and do something yourself. Here's a bit of music. Ta-ra!
You're listening to the Forum from the BBC World Service. Well, now it's time to come to your ideas, Daniel Goleman. You're a psychologist specialising in emotional behaviour, and probably most people know you for your influential ideas advocating the need for emotional intelligence. But you've now moved on to what you call ecological intelligence, and I suppose you could say it's a sort of plea to all of us to think a bit harder about our shopping, to work out the ecological cost or damage of all our purchases. And you say we need to do this because we've lost touch with the instinctive knowledge we once had about how to behave in harmony with nature.
Yeah, the book really has an evolutionary psychology frame, much like Dennis's, but my notion is that early, during these 80,000 generations when we became who we are at the neural level, the critical skill was knowing how to live in your local ecosystem, knowing how to survive. And that skill began to disappear with Industrial Revolution. Today, we have no idea how to survive without, the grocer and the hardware and everything that we buy.
Which herbs, if you brew, might solve a headache. That sort of thing.
Precisely, yeah. And, who knows what bark is going to help you with a headache. However, the problem is that we have been so disconnected from the impacts of what we do on ecosystems that now we have every one of us has a huge global ecological footprint, and we're doing harm to miners exposed to carcinogenic ores in Kazakhstan, or miners who are getting the rare metals for our electronics, in areas of Africa run by warlords, or people in China who are working in dye works and exposed to carcinogens for the clothes we wear, and we haven't a clue. And all I'm saying is we need to become aware, and I'm actually quite hopeful, because there are new information systems that can make each one of us aware as we're about to buy, which is the critical choice point we have in the system.
I can imagine us going around the supermarket with our handheld device, and you look at the washing powder and you click on it and you look at just where it was made, what the energy footprint is, what the cardboard's made from. But where does it end? I mean, you could go on, couldn't you? Tracing back all sorts of things.
Well, you don't need to do the tracing. It's been done for you. There's a system now used in the States called Good Guide that scores everything in its environmental, health, and social impacts through its entire life cycle, but it does it on a 10-point scale, and it instantly compares the impacts of detergent A to that of detergent B. So you now have information, you have transparency about the ecological truth behind what you buy, right?
I have trouble with this idea of ecological truth. How can you be absolutely sure that all the information is really good? I mean, I read about one example that struck me, particularly because of you, Dennis, sitting in the South Island of New Zealand, that possibly eating meat from New Zealand might be better ecologically than eating meat from closer to home, because it had been raised in a much more organic, careful way, even though it had to be flown all that way. Who's giving you this information? Maybe it's New Zealand farmers.
Here's the good news. It's not the farmers. Or if it is, don't trust it. What you want to trust is a new discipline. It's called industrial ecology. Industrial ecologists are a blend of chemistry, biology, environmental science, industrial design, and it's an independent group that in fact audits the ecological impacts, from extraction through manufacture, through retail, use, and disposal. And the credible evaluations are done independently, and they're certifiable, they're auditable. And so there's now, for the first time, independent, trustworthy information. I'm not talking about greenwashing. The organic T-shirt that you just bought, they didn't mention that the dyes are carcinogens. They didn't mention its water footprint. They didn't mention 100 things about it. Now we can know all that. And what that does is level the playing field. It gives power to us, the consumer, that we've never had before. Because if each one of us did 3 things, it would make a tremendous difference. One is know the impacts, true impacts of what you buy. Second is favor improvements. And third, tell everyone you know. If we all did that, we would shift market share in the direction of more ecologically virtuous goods, which creates a huge business imperative to abandon the technologies and the chemicals that we use now that are creating the ecological disasters. It would make a business case for it.
Can I just ask you, Daniel, when I was reading your book, the first part of it it was disheartening, because I thought, here we've been thinking about how ecologically responsible we are, and it really doesn't make a difference in those small ways. But then I started reading about, your ideas of radical transparency, and I just wondered, do you think we'll ever get there in our lifetime? I mean, maybe you need to devise an intermediate step called emotional transparency, because
to encourage people, because it can be quite bewildering, can't it?
What I mean is everything that cynical people at least know about corporate culture is that it's a culture of secrecy, opacity, and how do you get them to transform?
Right, and that's why it's important that you make a business case for it. In other words, if people are starting to know what the true ecological impacts are of goods and are favoring better goods, then the more forward-looking businesses will see that our strategy has got to be to capture that market, to abandon the chemical range that now is based on petroleum. It's all carcinogens to a large extent, and start thinking about biomimicry, about a true green chemistry. It's starting to happen. It's happening because, oddly enough, there's pressure within the business community to look for suppliers that are better, because lots of companies think that the coming generation, today's children, are going to care urgently about this, not today's adults. We're ingrained. It's harder for us to be mindful of this when we shop. Kids are passionate about it because their shared generational trauma is a world in ecological meltdown. So it's the companies that want to survive for the next 10, 20 years that are starting to pressure this even before we consumers are asking for it.
Can I just go back to something you said right at the beginning, which is this is all partly about lost instincts, and come to you, Dennis, because you were talking at the beginning of the programme about art being about universal values, instincts we all shared going back thousands and thousands of years. So what do you think about this idea of Daniel's? In fact, in another way, we've forgotten a lot of old natural ways and values of our forebears.
Would we really want to go back to a world where we knew all about the various bark remedies for illnesses, which were mostly placebos or actually had lots of side effects that were not quantifiable? Or would we rather have the modern pharmaceutical industries? Yes, they may pollute the Rhine River. Yes, they do have byproducts that are unpleasant. But I don't think I'd want to give up modern medicine. You know, I mean, Daniel, you talk about a village called Sher in Tibet, where it's incredibly cold half the year. I suppose it gets up to something that's livable the other half of the year. And people have a way of repairing their houses using willow branches, which they sustainably then somehow surgically put back into the tree so it'll grow. So when the house is in disrepair next year, they can repair it again. And you give this as a sort of a symbolic expression of sustainability. You know, the other way to look at it would be this is a symbolic expression of primitivism. Actually, the average life expectancy of people who live in Sher might be about 38 years.
Well, Dennis, I'm not saying we should go back. Dennis, I'm not saying we should go back. What I'm saying is we should look at the world we live in now and understand, for example, there are 80,000 industrial chemicals in use today, many thousands of which are carcinogens, endocrine disruptors. They are slowly poisoning us, and we continue to blithely buy the things that they're in. Your electronics use brominated fire retardants, so they won't burst into flames. But I'm sorry, those are carcinogens. They break down molecule by molecule, go into the house dust. Years later, you get cancer. You don't know why, but each of us carries a body burden of these industrial chemicals. What I'm saying is let's wake up. Let's say, well, I'm not going to buy the electronic with the brominates. I want a replacement that doesn't have the negativity. We have to adapt ecological intelligence to the realities of modern life.
It's interesting that you're talking about adaptation here, because that's where we began the program, isn't it? Dennis was talking about charting evolutionary change, including in the use of art over generations. But you're talking about speeding it up through collaboration and technical assistance.
I'm saying the new adaptation is to avoid what's being called the sixth extinction. There have been 5 extinction episodes throughout human evolution. We are now in what's called the Anthropocene age. The Pleistocene has ended. The Anthropocene age began with the Industrial Revolution, when human activity began to melt down our own ecological niche. And we have a collective crisis, and if we don't adapt, not us, but our children's children's children may vanish from this ecological niche. It's an urgency, but it's an urgency, I'm sorry, that escapes the range of danger that the Pleistocene shaped our brain for. We need a new way of thinking. We need an information prosthetic, if you will, that will help us make the wise choices now for future generations.
It's a very compelling message, but what's fascinating about it is how do you convey the urgency? In other words, how do you speed up the adaptation? And I'm thinking of Wendy's book, where she charts this girl who has a brutal leap from a sort of primitive, almost Stone Age village into the 20th century digital world of the city. And what happens to her? She's totally traumatized. So you can't do it too fast, that suggests.
And it just goes back to what you said about the learned, so many instincts that have to be relearned.
Yeah, I think I actually am a strong advocate of eco-literacy programs for kids that teach them the true ecological damage done by the material world and show them how to improve so that they'll grow up naturally making better choices. I think we need to rethink what we tell our children.
We certainly would have to do this, but wouldn't we have to do it in a way that actually didn't throw out the advances of civilization?
Oh, I'm not talking about... Dennis, I'm not talking about throwing it out. I'm talking about the next advance, the next one. The next one has to be biomimicry. You know, our
But
old
it's hard
technologies... Dennis, forgive me for talking over you, but listen, it's a very key point. Our current industrial base, our processes, our chemical palette was chosen and developed in an age before we had industrial ecology, before we had a metric for ecological impacts. Now that we have that lens, we have to rethink everything. We have to reinvent everything. So I'm talking about the next leap, not going back, going forward.
But it's a hard sell in a world where people know that the average life expectancy across the world is longer than it's ever been. Yeah, there are more cancers because cancer is a disease of old age.
I don't think it's a hard sell, Dennis. Dennis, it comes down to this. If you're a mom shopping for a sunscreen for your kid, wouldn't you like to know which one has the chemical that becomes a carcinogen when exposed to sun? True story. You know, it has to do with our own urge to protect ourselves and our family.
Here's another side of the argument. I accept everything you say about the colorings that go into T-shirts. Nevertheless, the production of cotton and cotton T-shirts is expensive in terms of water, environmental damage, pesticides perhaps. On the other hand, I can tell you this, the T-shirt itself, the reason it is worn worldwide, particularly in tropical climates, is that it is one of the most comfortable, I think, pleasant inventions of the human race in the 20th century.
Dennis, I really
T-shirts are worn everywhere because they are such a fine garment.
Here's what I realize. Dennis, ecological intelligence requires the creative instinct. Because the answer is not to abandon T-shirts. The answer is to reinvent T-shirts so they don't use carcinogenic dyes. They aren't made from substance which takes huge amounts of water in arid parts of the world, that doesn't use chemical fertilizers that kill water through eutrophication. In other words, we need to look at what is useful and think how to make it useful in a way that does not commit suicide for us as a species, in a slow, invisible way.
Wendy, are you convinced?
To that.
Well, I'm fascinated, but I wish I could be reassured that this is something that we can achieve in our lifetime. Do you think so?
I don't know if we can achieve it in our lifetime, but I think we can set it in motion in our lifetime by, first of all, making it matter in the marketplace, which is going to induce companies to do lots of R&D. I was just, styrofoam, for example, is a substance that never breaks down. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there's a huge patch of floating plastic and styrofoam. It will never become water. It kills fish.
The thing is, it's very easy to make the case for the things that horrify you, like all those plastic bags floating in the Pacific. But there are lots of areas in the middle of our activity and consumerism, where there's a kind of trade-off, isn't there? I suppose that's really what Dennis is talking about with T-shirts, and that's where it gets tricky. And I'm just not convinced that many consumers who are thinking about what they've got in their purse to spend today, and they've got a screaming child and they need to leave the shop quickly, the sort of rational big picture that you put out, I'm not sure whether on a day-to-day basis purchasers are going to follow that.
Where I was going with styrofoam is that some bright, inventive, creative student has come up with a styrofoam replacement made out of rice hulls from, byproduct of rice, and mushroom roots, and it works just as well. It's no threat to the world. I think this is the map for the future, and I'm not saying that it requires that the busy mom stop and do this. I think what it really requires is that the business person who's buying from supplier A or supplier B choose the more virtuous option so that the housewife doesn't need to make the choice herself. It's been done.
But radical transparency, Bridget, is already here, evident here in the Bush House downstairs. I noticed the sign that showed how much electricity was being generated and how many carbon.
In fact, it's already coming.
Yeah.
That's right.
BBC World Service, we try to move with the times. Thank you very much, Daniel Goleman, and thanks to all three of my guests.
Thank you very much.
Dennis Dutton,
Thank
Wendy
you.
Loyo,
Thank you.
and Daniel Goleman.
Thank you.
As a child in the Canadian countryside, Glenn Schaefer was fascinated by the subtle complexity of the living world around him. by the delicate balance of insect, plant and animal life many of us take for granted. After beginning his academic career in physics, he has now come back to ecology, and in particular to studies of the insect populations so often branded by man as pests. Professor Schaefer has developed radar and infrared techniques that allow him to track migrating locusts, moths or aphids through the sky, as swarms or even as individuals, though they may be several kilometers away and high overhead. Through the greater understanding this gives, his work is pointing him to new strategies for controlling insects that are more effective and less harmful to the rest of the natural environment. It's also shown him the futility of indiscriminate spraying of crops and forests, something which, by destroying natural predators and reducing plants' natural immunity, can do more harm than good.
The most worked out example that I've been involved with through our radar work, etc., has been the spruce budworm moth in the Canadian forest area of the East Canada, which is, we now know, the manager of that forest, in that whenever the insects become very numerous, they overeat the buds of the trees, the old trees mainly, which then die, blow down, burn up, and the young ones come through. And it has been found that in this natural cycle of build-up and return to low levels again, during the build-up stage, in recent times, men have said, we want that forest for our big fat newspapers, etc., on the weekends, and we now have lots of aircraft and insecticide. Let us finally deal with this disaster of a dying forest, not realizing that only by such a procedure the forest can continue and the young have their sunlight.
What has been the long-term effect then of frequent attempts to control the spruce budworm through spraying?
Wherever spray has been used, it has been found to be needed again the next year, and the result is that it has created in those very areas a permanent epidemic of spruce budworm instead of a cycle. This is a clear example of a situation now occurring in every country on Earth, wherever chemicals are used widely, which is virtually everywhere. The more you spray, the more you kill, the more you have the next season. That is true everywhere. We need only touch this delicately balanced, huge entity, the body of nature, full of huge forces, to upset the balance ever so slightly. 0.5%, 1%. We're now only learning that. In our ignorance, we think we have the power to have dominion by bringing forward science and technology to our advantage. The result is that nature has replied to undo excessive profit, excessive food production, usually for the purpose of greed.
Professor Schaefer's work is largely concerned with the effects of chemical pesticides on the body of nature and with devising alternative treatments for crop diseases. But he also makes some interesting comparisons with human medicine, with the effects of chemical drugs on the bodies of people.
I've noticed this, and the more I think of it, the clearer it becomes, the parallel between an individual's body and the way he tries to get help for it from chemical medicine, and the body of nature and the way we try to treat that apparent infection in the case of nature on a large scale. With the human body, we pour in chemicals in order to kill so-called germs. On nature, we pour on chemicals to kill. The result is, in both cases, very similar. In our own bodily case, we are now warned, even by doctors, not to overuse agents because of immunity being set up, so that when you really need something later, that may not be effective if you used too much earlier on. This is exactly the same with chemicals on a field. The more you use it, the more side effects you have. So this is very alarming indeed. We now must view these chemicals, which are very rare kinds of inventions, both medicinally and on nature, as a valuable resource not to be used unless absolutely necessary. This is not in the interest of the industries concerned, and it's a tough problem. This is leading us to rapidly turn towards non-chemical means, biological means for dealing with pest problems. To use a biological has great attraction because there are biological controls already in the natural system. Any particular so-called pest has usually a variety of biological agents around it, viruses, for example, bacteria, specifically for its own species, control. The technology is much more difficult, naturally, because ignorance will no longer do. A chemical allows you to be ignorant because it's non-selective in general. But for the first time in the Western world, we have had success working with the Forestry Commission here in Scotland and the Institute of Virology to, in fact, have 3 years of success in a row by aircraft spraying of biological materials at an economic rate, so that control is now turning rapidly away from the chemicals in the Forestry Commission to biologicals. And this seems to be the way forward now for the world.
Can you imagine a similar strategy developing for treating disease in people in the same sort of way as you can use biological controls for treating pests in forestry or agriculture?
The use of biologicals on nature requires careful monitoring of what is going on, more and more knowledge of what you're doing and the timing of it. That's already beginning to take place in medicine, is it not? In which scanning devices are coming along, much more routine. Checkups are being made by people, so that a general awareness is going up, which means understanding is increasing of both systems, and this must be good.
A country, but children.
En partenariat avec webSYNradio, l'éveil du son sur la radio parfaite, la web radio du Printemps des Arts de Monte Carlo vous propose une programmation exclusive de JanEK SCHAEFER.
The fundamental problem with the current economic system is that it relies upon continuous growth. And continuous growth in a finite planet becomes at some point impossible. Capitalism, with that perspective, looks rather like a pyramid scheme, a system whose apparent health today relies on unsecured loans from the future. It's hard to see how you can achieve anything remotely resembling long-term sustainable solutions if at the same time you've got growth continually pushing up behind and ensuring that your use of resources and your creation of pollution is just going to keep rising. It's inevitable that those two aims are going to clash. So the question then becomes, well, what do we do about capitalism?
And that brings us to the golden arrow of consumption. This is the heart of the system, the engine that drives it. It is so important that protecting this arrow has become the top priority for both of these guys. That's why after 9/11, when our country was in shock, and President Bush could have suggested any number of appropriate things, to grieve, to pray, to hope. No, he said to shop, to shop. We have become a nation of consumers. Our primary identity has become that of being consumers, not mothers, teachers, farmers, but consumers. The primary way that our value is measured and demonstrated is by how much we contribute to this arrow, how much we consume. And do we? We shop and shop and shop, keep the materials flowing, and flow they do. Guess what percentage of total materials flow through this system is still in product or use 6 months after their date of sale in North America? 50%? 20? No, 1%. 1. In other words, 99% of the stuff we harvest, mine, process, transport, 99% of the stuff we run through this system is trashed within 6 months. Now, how can we run a planet with that level of materials throughput? It wasn't always like this. The average U.S. person now consumes twice as much as they did 50 years ago. Ask your grandma. In her day, stewardship and resourcefulness and thrift were valued. So how did this happen? For one thing, this system looks like it's fine. No problem. But the truth is, it's a system in crisis. And the reason it's a system in crisis is it's a linear system and we live on a finite planet. And you cannot run a linear system on a finite planet indefinitely. Every step along the way, this system is interacting with the real world. In real life, it's not happening.
We want to have it all. We want to have our holidays in the sun, our huge car in the drive, our plasma screen TV the size of Belgium. We want all of these wonderful things, and we want a clear conscience. We want to believe we're on the side of the angels, even when we're indulging in all these destructive activities. Even when we're indulging in activities which are not just going to kill people in the future, they are killing people now. And governments know this. They know that we want two completely different things. And so they recognize that what we want them to do is to talk about climate change, to talk a lot about what they're doing and about make extravagant promises about how they're going to curtail our emissions, but not to do it. Because if they were to do it, then the party's over. Supposed to be 18 times richer by the end of the century than we are today. Where's that 18 times more money going to go? Are we all going to have Olympic-sized swimming pools? Are we all going to have 6 cars in the drive? Are we all going to be flying off every weekend? In which case, where do you put the airports? Where do you put the roads? Where's all the land required to suck up this massive amount of wealth? And you can see very clearly that beyond a certain point, wealth becomes a cause of deprivation. We have reached that point. We have reached the point of maximum welfare already. Beyond that, the optimum economic growth is surpassed and our welfare plainly declines beyond that point. And so we have to say, stop. But governments, no one in government is talking about that. No one is saying that we should stop. No one is saying that we'll even ever reach a point where we have to stop.
There are over 100,000 synthetic chemicals in use in commerce today. Only a handful of them have even been tested for health impacts, and none have been tested for synergistic health impacts. That means when they interact with all the other chemicals we're exposed to every day. So we don't know the full impact on health and the environment of all these toxic chemicals, but we do know one thing. Toxics in, toxics out. As long as we keep putting toxics into our industrial production systems, we're going to keep getting toxics in the stuff that we bring into our homes and workplaces and schools, and our bodies. Like BFRs, brominated flame retardants, they're a chemical that make things more fireproof, but they are super toxic. They're a neurotoxin. That means toxic to the brain. What are we even doing using a chemical like this? Yet we put it in our computers, our appliances, couches, mattresses, even some pillows. In fact, we take our pillows, we douse them in a neurotoxin, we bring them home and put our heads on them for 8 hours a night to sleep. Now, I don't know, but it seems to me in this country with so much potential, we could think of a better way to stop our heads from catching on fire at night. What about recycling? Does recycling help? Yes, recycling helps. Recycling reduces the garbage at this end, and it reduces the pressure to mine and harvest new stuff at this end. Yes, 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 we should all recycle, but recycling is not enough. Recycling will never be enough, for a couple reasons. First, the waste coming out of our houses is just the tip of the iceberg. For every 1 garbage can of waste you put out on the curb, 70 garbage cans of waste were made upstream just to make the junk in that 1 garbage can you put out on the curb. So even if we could recycle 100% of the waste coming out of our households, it doesn't get to the core of the problem. So here we are running up against our first limit. We are running out of resources. We are using too much stuff. Now, I know this can be hard to hear, but it's the truth, so we've got to deal with it. In the past 3 decades alone, 1/3 of the planet's natural resource base has been consumed. Gone. We are cutting and mining and hauling and trashing the place so fast that we're undermining the planet's very ability for people to live here. Where I live, in the United States, we have less than 4% of our original forests left. 40% of the waterways have become undrinkable. And our problem is not just that we're using too much stuff, but we're using more than our share. We have 5% of the world's population, but we're using 30% of the world's resources and creating 30% of the world's waste. If everybody consumed at US rates, we would need 3 to 5 planets. And you know what? We've only got 1.
If I just say a little bit about the health and the medicine thing, I gave a talk a little while ago in Penzance for the Transition Time group there, and I said as part of that one of the things that the health and medicine group in Totnes is doing is looking at the question of what are the 10 most frequently prescribed drugs that doctors in Totnes give to people. Do they have a herbal or locally producible replacement? How much would we need? And to start thinking about building in place a kind of a local apothecary infrastructure, as it were, so that we actually have something to fall back on, because at the moment we don't. And you look in Iraq now, for example, when the medical supplies stop coming in, it's extremely difficult because there's nothing to fall back on. There's no resilience in terms of the healthcare system. And I gave this talk, and this man came up at the end, and he said, "Oh, I'm a GP. I'm a doctor. I work here in Falmouth and in Penzance, and I've been sitting there listening to you talking, thinking, well, actually, the 10 drugs I prescribe most often are actually for side effects of cheap oil. I'd never thought about it before, but actually, I prescribe this drug, which is for obesity. I prescribe this drug, which is for excess stomach acid from overeating and eating the wrong food. I prescribe this drug, which is for stress." He listed it all through, and he had this penny had dropped, which was, he said, actually, the oil age makes people sick. That actually so many of the diseases that we have now are diseases that are caused by the lifestyle that oil has brought us. And it's the myth that actually the oil age has brought us this fantastic progress and development and marvellous things. Actually, you can run alongside, and they did a very good study in Dublin, in Ireland, where they took the growth curve of the Irish economy and the growth curve of the amount of oil availability in Ireland, which mirror each other pretty much exactly. But then also mirroring that curve almost exactly are obesity rates, levels of heart disease, days off work from stress, the murder rate, the suicide rate, amounts of people admitted for clinical depression. That all these things follow the same curve. And so in terms of healthcare and medicine and how we're going to respond to that, it's a huge question. But I think again, if we can really rethink some basic assumptions, we can come to some very exciting conclusions.
Really going to start moving when we see the connections, when we see the big picture. When people along the system get united, we can reclaim and transform this linear system into something new, a system that doesn't waste resources or people. Because what we really need to chuck is that old school throwaway mindset. There's a new school of thinking on this stuff, and it's based on sustainability and equity, green chemistry, zero waste, closed loop production, renewable energy, local living economies. It's already happening. Now, some say it's unrealistic, idealistic that it can't happen, but I say the ones who are unrealistic are those that want to continue with the old path. That's dreaming.
Why are American cities designed so it's almost impossible not to have a car? Why were 100 railways in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles bought up and then deliberately destroyed? Why did the electric car get scrapped? Why were we, along with Australia, the only 2 countries not to sign the original Kyoto Climate Treaty? Why was an oil company lobbyist allowed to change official government reports on global warming? Why was the same PR firm employed by the tobacco industry to persuade the public that smoking is healthy, then employed by the oil industry to convince us there was still doubt about climate change? Alternative energy has been available for 50 years. Why have we barely used it? Why were solar panels taken off the White House? Because, right from the early days of the industry, the oil men and their obscene profits have had an unhealthy influence on the people running our country. And now they are the people running our country. And they're providing the cash, too. Oil business isn't just in bed with the government, it is the government.
So any last thoughts or words of advice or encouragement? Yeah, I think that we find ourselves at an extraordinary point in history, and I for one find it an exhilarating time to be around. Really, you know, we can no longer ignore the signs that we have to do things, and on a scale that we've never done before. You know, we're faced with the most profound changes, and I think we have to really engage people in a way we've never engaged before. We have to inspire and enthuse people. And we're inviting people to join us on a collective adventure, to embark on a journey to something. And for me, I've been involved in environmental things for a long time. I was involved in protests against new roads being built in the UK in the 90s, and anti-nuclear stuff in the 1980s. The danger with campaigning against stuff, always campaigning against stuff, is that you come up against all the time the sort of the institutional refusal to shift. And as an activist, it's exhausting. And so many people get really burnt out by doing that kind of work. Whereas I find doing the Transition Town approach is working towards making the same kind of change, but it's so nourishing, and as someone doing it, it really feeds you, and you get so much from seeing the kind of enthusiasm that it generates, because it avoids that them and us dynamic, and it comes in underneath the radar. An expression by Jean Dubuffet, who was an artist, used to say that art never lies down in the bed that's made for it, and its best moments are when it forgets what it's called. And I think this process has that sort of playful kind of nature, and it can put on different hats for who it's meeting, and it can put on a suit and tie and go along and speak to the council, and it can put on wellies and go and talk to farmers, and it can go into the schools, and it can go and talk to the, you know, it really has to have that ability to draw people in. And I think you can do that so much more effectively by being for something rather than being against something. And I think the power of creating collective visions of where we want to go, creating a roadmap of how it could be in such a way that people can smell it and feel it and almost taste it. If you threw your window open in the morning in 2025 in a powered down, relocalized Totnes, living in a powered down world, what would it be like? What would it sound like when you look out? What would you have for breakfast? What would you hear as you walk down the street? Where would you go? You know, and I think when there's so much stuff that's bubbling up for people saying, peak oil, climate change, overpopulation, you know, that actually something which can really present that is very, very powerful. One of my favourite quotes is Arundhati Roy, who's an Indian novelist, who says, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day I can hear her breathing. Thing in the UK that's just happening now, where the UK government has proposed road pricing on the roads, a kind of a toll on the roads in order to sort of start managing traffic numbers and reduce traffic, which is kind of like road rationing in a sense. And one of the sort of right-wing newspapers organised this petition, and they had 8 million people sign this petition. You think, we have to have carbon rationing, and we really need carbon rationing now. And if this is what people are, if this is the response to that, what would it be to carbon rationing? And carbon rationing will happen inevitably. If you have a depleting resource, at some point you have to ration it. The sooner you ration it, the more equitable the process is going to be. But the question is, for me, I think that part of the thing with transition towns is it's really kind of softening people up at the grassroots, rather than because it's a fear response. If you say we don't want road rationing, we're going to sign a petition, we want to keep our cars, but if you have a very gentle process saying, sorry, it's not going to be actually, the cars, we have to let go of the cars, but we have to rethink what we're going to do instead, and actually the future without cars could be far, far preferable to the present with all these blooming cars everywhere. So I think that's the answer, really. Obviously, at the moment, it is possible that we could heat Totnes, keep people warm sustainably. It's not possible that we could have them all driving hundreds of miles to work every day. And I think that's part of the process with the energy descent plan is, here's a diminishing energy base. Do you actually want to use this energy doing frivolous, pointless, ridiculous things? Or are we actually going to spend this on the essentials, which is keeping people warm at an affordable price?
Decision, some unpopular decision, and they'd suddenly leg it and say,
This is a litre of oil. Oil has become the lifeblood of how we feed, entertain and house ourselves. Indeed, it's what makes our modern lifestyles possible. This bottle of motor oil contains energy equivalent to my working hard physically for about 5 weeks. And any time you go to a garage and fill your tank with 40 litres of petrol, you're putting into that car energy equivalent to about 4 years hard human manual labour, all for £50. And many experts argue that we're now entering the end of the age of cheap oil, what we call peak oil, the point beyond which world oil production enters a terminal decline. And that, coupled with the climate change agenda, which argues that really the best place for this is to stay in the ground, means that we need to rethink a number of very basic assumptions about how we live in this century.
All through history, the way of truth and love has always won.
To be a little...
Where the vast protests and demonstrations. There are a few very brave people who have been doing things like this, but they are very poorly supported by the population as a whole. We're fast asleep. We're sleepwalking into this catastrophe. And unless far more people wake up, we're going to find ourselves in the midst of it when we all wake up, and it'll be too late.
And they have the local cinema showing that as the trailer to every film in the 3 months running up to their official unleashing, which is brilliant. And they're involved in a campaign to stop the particles being developed by Alaska. And rather than being out there protesting and saying, we don't want this, we must stop this, we must campaign against this, they've come at it from a very different way, the sort of positive solutions way, where they produced this newspaper article written by a journalist called Mavis Happen. That was a newspaper article from 2017 that was talking about how how Lewes was now the most sustainable town in the UK, and it could all be traced back to this inspirational development that took place on this piece of land in 2008, which then triggered the whole economic regeneration of the town. There's the town of Stroud in Gloucester, transition town Stroud. They're very moving ahead very strongly, and they're looking at doing. That used to be a textiles town. Lots of textiles produced there. So they're looking at how they could revive textiles as part of a relocalisation initiative, local currencies. Transition town Falmouth in Cornwall, there's Transition Penwith, which is an area of Cornwall. They're actually now looking at amalgamating and doing a Transition Cornwall on a bigger kind of scale for the whole county. There's the city of Bristol, who are sort of breaking Bristol down into its different parts and looking at that. And I had a phone call the other day from Transition Isle of Wight, which is an island off the south of England, which is all rather interesting to do it on that kind of scale. So it does seem to have a momentum behind it as an idea. And as I say, it's a very simple idea that the future with less oil could be better. And I think climate change campaigning and environmental campaigning really struggles to engage people because actually it comes from the angle of you'd better change because it's going to be really, really desperately awful, and the supposed motivator for change is sheer terror of how ghastly everything is going to be. And you have people like James Lovelock out there saying nothing any of you can do can make any difference to this. This is just happening and we're doomed and we're finished. And people instinctively just shut down. I think when they encounter that, they shut down completely. What can I do? I can't do anything. It's just beyond me. Whereas the transition town approach says could be fantastic. Actually, life beyond. Who says life without oil is going to be awful? Actually, there are people in the world who live on a tenth of the oil that we use in the UK, and arguably have a more fulfilling lifestyle. But we've just become so blinkered that we have to have, in order to be happy, we have to burn lots of oil, and I think that the power with the transition town approach is it's sort of gently taking people's hand and saying, come on, we can go through this and we can transition this, and actually it can be fantastic.
En partenariat avec webSYNradio, l'éveil du son sur la radio parfaite, la web radio du Printemps des Arts de Monte Carlo vous propose une programmation exclusive de JanEK SCHAEFER.
Well, I was born in 1950, which makes me a baby boomer. And I guess the baby boomers could be described as the most consumptive generation in world history. During our time on the planet, let's just say 1945 to, pick an arbitrary date, 2030. During that period of time, roughly half of the world's critical, non-renewable resources will have been consumed. That's a stunning fact when you think about it. One generation consuming half of the world's non-renewable resources for all of time. I think for those of us who are in this generation, and therefore in a stage of life where we have more responsibilities, more maybe power, influence, wealth, control, it's really up to us now to redeem ourselves and make some hard choices.
There's a home in which
When you think about how unique oil is in terms of its chemistry, its energy density, and so on, to think that what we're doing with it is simply pulling it out of the ground and burning it as fast as we possibly can seems utterly outrageous. This is the most unintelligent thing we could possibly do with this amazing stuff. Most overpopulated country. We humans like to pride ourselves on our intelligence, and of course, here we are able to make computers and video cameras and all kinds of complex technologies. Wonderful stuff. But really, nature only cares about one kind of intelligence, and that's the intelligence that would enable us to look at what we're doing and the likely consequences of our actions, to be able to judge which consequences are detrimental to our own survival prospects, and then change our behavior accordingly. If we can do that, then I think nature will judge us as being an intelligent species. If we can't, then I don't think we have right to think of ourselves as being any more intelligent than yeast, which would be acting exactly the same way. If we put them in a bottle of grape juice, they'd be eating up the sugar in the grape juice, consuming their energy source, and at the same time they'd be giving off a waste product, namely alcohol, which would be poisoning them. And so their numbers would proliferate until they ate up their energy sources and poisoned themselves with their waste product, and then they'd have a die-off. We're doing exactly the same thing with fossil fuels. We're eating up our energy source as fast as we can, and we're polluting the environment with the waste product. So are we smarter than yeast? That's the question. We'll find out. Watermills and windmills and so on. But all of those sources of energy were minuscule compared to oil, which is a very concentrated source of energy. Maybe you've had the experience of running out of petrol in your car and having to push it off to the side of the road. You know that's hard work. Well, now imagine having to push your car 20 or 30 miles. That's the energy equivalent of something like 6 to 8 weeks of hard human labor. And we get that for just currently, where I live in California, $2.50. We've created a situation where we're completely dependent on cheap oil. Cheap oil will soon be a thing of the past. There are no easy alternatives. And how are Americans supposed to get around? How are they supposed to produce their food and transport their food and other essential materials? Without cheap oil, we've left ourselves absolutely no other option. Meanwhile, the fact that we're consuming so much of this unique and non-renewable resource has enormous political and geopolitical implications. The rest of the world looks to the U.S. and they say, how can these people do this? We've overthrown governments. We've interfered in the economies of other nations for decades so that America could maintain this unsustainable way of life. And at the end of the day, we're left with a hollow shell. Now, with fossil fuels, we were able to intensify the process of food production. We were able to substitute fuel-fed machines for things like horses and oxen, which themselves required farmland to grow food for. Once we did that, we sort of circumvented the whole net energy equation, so that now we invest far more energy in producing food than we actually get out of the food in terms of the biological process of digestion. So for every calorie of food that we produce in the world today, we invest something like 10 calories of fossil fuel energy. Again, we can do this for the time being with fossil fuel subsidies. It works as long as we have the cheap fossil fuels. But as soon as the cheap fossil fuels are gone, we're stuck. We have no other way to produce massive quantities of food right now. And without the cheap energy inputs, we're probably headed for global famine. When we first started using fossil fuels, there were fewer than 1 billion human beings alive. We achieved 1 billion right around 1820, early in the Industrial Revolution. We got up to 2 billion around 1930, 3 billion in the 1960s, 4 billion in the 70s, 5 billion in the late 1980s. We got up to 6 billion humans by 1999, and we've added more than 500 million more humans just since the turn of the 21st century. So if you look at that purely from a biological perspective, that's an enormous success for one species, but it's a very perilous kind of success. Sort of in the very heart of capitalist ideology, and that was only exacerbated once we discovered fossil fuels, and we came to believe that growth was not only possible in perpetuity, but that it was absolutely necessary. This is what life is all about, growing the economy, constantly growing. Modern economic theory looks at the environment as being a subset of the economy, which can always grow bigger and bigger. Of course, the reality of the situation is exactly the opposite. The human economy is a subset of the environment, and if the environment falters, the economy can't continue to grow. In fact, the economy can only grow to certain limits. As soon as the economy begins to impact the environment in such a way that the environment will collapse, then the economy is going to collapse too. America used to have a good public transportation system back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Actually, I can remember when I was a small child riding a train between Kansas City and St. Louis. Today, none of that exists, or very little of it. I live in a city of 175,000 people, and there is no train in that city, neither for passengers nor for freight. What happened was that General Motors, Firestone, Standard Oil of California, and some other corporations colluded during the 30s, 40s, and 50s to buy up all of the trolleys and most passenger trains throughout the U.S. and simply junk them so that Americans would have no other alternatives. So they'd have to buy passenger cars, and if they wanted to ride public transportation, then they'd have to ride in diesel-powered buses that were smelly and inefficient and had really inconvenient schedules. So public transportation in the U.S. has basically evaporated over the past few decades. It has some of the worst public transportation in the world, and yet it's the richest nation in the world. It's absurd. We who are alive today are in competition not with other species so much as with our own descendants. We are actively reducing the survival opportunities of our own children and grandchildren. There's never been anything quite like this before in human history. I'm afraid future generations are not going to be very sympathetic toward us today. They're going to look at us and say, my God, you had everything. You had all the energy in the world. You had all the raw materials. You had plenty of fresh water. You had topsoil. You had cheap food. And what did you do with it? You just used it all as quickly as you could. You did it in a way that was completely unsustainable. You destroyed the habitat of thousands of other species. You ruined the global climate. I'm afraid they're going to look at us and regard us as monsters. Frankly, my fear is that younger people in 2 or 3 decades are going to look at old folks as a failed generation, and rather than making the effort to try to take care of us while their own lives are descending into misery, are just going to say, well, you had a go at it, you had a good time, and you left nothing for us, so now fend for yourselves.
3-5 round.
It's one thing to be consuming the world's resources at completely unsustainable rates if you don't know any better. But, since the 1970s, 1980s, we've had all the information we need. There's really no excuse anymore for us to be blithely continuing as though somehow this can go on forever. It's not going to go on forever. It's not going to go on very much longer at all. Maybe we are no smarter than yeast. I suppose you could say any species presented with the ability and the opportunity to consume all the world's resources would do so. So I guess you could say we're no worse than microbes or choose a species and do a thought experiment. But it doesn't make me very proud as a human being.
But of course it was, because we did it knowingly.
Yeah, right, yeah.
That's not good enough. That's not good enough. For us.
Absolutely clear that the one priority of the human family for the 21st century is to end its reliance on fossil fuels, period. It's that simple. It's not going to be easy. We've become extremely dependent on these materials, but they are non-renewable, so therefore it's not a question of negotiation. They will run out at some point. And it's clear that the use of these materials is poisoning our climate and undercutting the survival possibilities of our own children and grandchildren. So systematically, cooperatively, as intelligently, and as quickly as we can, we simply have to end our consumption of fossil fuels. It's going to take us a few decades to do that, but we have to begin immediately with a crash program scale of effort, the kind of effort that we undertook during World War II, where the advertising industry, manufacturing, the corporations, the government, all were involved at the very top level of effort. Individuals also have to be involved in this, so that the sense of duty and obligation has to be mobilized. I think the advertising industry could do this very well. It did it during World War II. It almost sounds too simple that we only have one task for the 21st century. There's some kind of process of psychological adjustment that people go through when they hear this dreadful information, and then gradually over time they go through the stages of grief, denial and anger and bargaining and then finally acceptance. And then when they actually start to do something about it, and it's only when people actually start to do something about it that I see a transformation occur, where people who've accustomed themselves to this really dismal, dreary information actually end up being some of the happiest people I know. There are people who look back to the Great Depression and World War II nostalgically. I mean, these were times when people were dying and starving. It was horrific, and yet people were working together. There was a sense that we're all part of the same team, and if we make some sacrifices, if we bring out the best in ourselves and each other, then there will be a reward at the end of the day. We have to do the same thing now, and I think we'll be much, much better people for it and much happier people for it.
L'éveil du son sur la Radio Parfaite, la web radio du Printemps des Arts de Monte Carlo, vous propose une programmation exclusive de JanEK SCHAEFER, en partenariat avec webSYNradio.
Something I've noticed is an extraordinary transition that's taken place in many people's minds over the past few years. To begin with, they were in complete denial about climate change, and they wouldn't hear it. Whatever you said, whatever evidence you put forward, people would just shut it out, and they would put their hands in their ears and shut their eyes and sing loudly if you tried to explain what was going on. And then suddenly, many of those same people go from that position to the position of saying, oh my God, it's terrible, it's awful, there's nothing whatever we can do. And it's exactly the same position, because it's a denial of responsibility. And despair is just as bad as denial, and it has exactly the same implications in that nothing happens if people despair. But somehow they manage to miss out the middle position, which is to say, yes, it's happening, yes, it's awful, and something can be done about it, and I'm going to do something about it. Because that requires responsibility, that requires action, that requires that people actually take power into their own hands, which is always something that people find difficult, but it has to be done. And because there is so little time and such a huge task, every single thing that people do is going to be significant. And people have the opportunity here to do things more significant than anyone's been able to do for thousands of years. The very fact that the crisis is taking place within our generation, that it's happening right now, means that we are tremendously powerful people. We have power over the future of the world for a very long time to come. So this position of despair and I can't do anything and there's no point is completely illogical. It's exactly the opposite. That you have this enormous power in your hands. You can do more than anybody has ever been able to do about something, and certainly more than anybody ever will be able to do about something, because in the future it will be too late. And when you...
Well, I come from this, suburban America. It's the outer perimeter of the city. It was a very safe environment, and it was a good place to come from, and that is, it was a good place to leave.
The crisis we're facing is at least as big as the last great global crisis, which was the rise of the Axis powers. And it requires a response at least as big if we're to prevent it from wiping out hundreds of millions of people. That's what runaway climate change will do. It will kill hundreds of millions of people, far more people than Hitler and his allies killed. If people had put their own immediate selfish interests ahead of the national interests during the Second World War, we would have lost. But at the moment, people are saying, how dare you even suggest that I can't have a plasma screen TV the size of a football pitch? How dare you even suggest that I can't fly to Thailand for my holidays? I refuse to give these things up. They are my fundamental rights. Have we become so soft and so selfish that we can't lay those down. When during the last great crisis, people were asked to lay down not their plasma screen TVs and their holidays to Thailand, but their lives? Have we become so soft and so selfish that we are asking other people to lay down their lives in other countries and in future generations so that we can maintain these plasma screen TVs and these holidays to Thailand? If so, it casts us in a pretty grim light.
3-time round.
Yeah,
That's twice what we each made 30 years ago. All of this garbage either gets dumped in a landfill, which is just a big hole in the ground, or if you're really unlucky, first it's burned in an incinerator and then dumped in the landfill. Either way, they both pollute the air, land, water. Incineration is really bad. Remember those toxics back in the production stage? Well, burning the garbage releases the toxics up into the air. Even worse, it makes new super toxics, like dioxin. Dioxin is the most toxic man-made substance known to science, and incinerators are the #1 source of dioxin. That means that we could stop the #1 source of the most toxic man-made substance known just by stopping burning the trash. We could stop it today. I was reading industrial design journals from the 1950s when planned obsolescence was really catching on. These designers are so open about it. They actually discuss how fast can they make stuff break that still leaves the consumer having enough faith in the product to go out and buy another one. It was so intentional. But stuff cannot break fast enough to keep this arrow afloat. So there's also perceived obsolescence. Now, perceived obsolescence convinces us to throw away stuff that is still perfectly useful. How do they do that? Well, they change the way the stuff looks. So if you bought your stuff a couple of years ago, everyone can tell that you haven't contributed to this arrow recently. And since the way we demonstrate our value is contributing to this arrow, it can be embarrassing. Like, I've had the same fat white computer monitor on my desk for 5 years. My coworker just got a new computer. She has a flat, shiny, sleek monitor. It matches her computer, it matches her phone, even her pen stand. She looks like she's driving in Spaceship Central, and I look like I'm at a washing machine on my desk. Fashion is another prime example of this. Have you ever wondered why women's shoe heels go from fat one year to skinny the next to fat to skinny? It's not because there's some debate about which heel structure is the most healthy for women's feet. It's because wearing fat heels in a skinny heel year shows everybody that you haven't contributed to that arrow as recently, so you're not as valuable as that person in skinny heels next to you, or more likely in some ad. It's to keep us buying new shoes. Advertisements and media in general plays a big role in this. Each of us in the U.S. is targeted with over 3... Things are really going to start moving when we see the connections, when we see the big picture. When people along the system get united, we can reclaim and transform this linear system into something new. A system that doesn't waste resources or people. Because what we really need to chuck is that old school throwaway mindset. There's a new school of thinking on this stuff, and it's based on sustainability and equity, green chemistry, zero waste, closed-loop production, renewable energy, local living economies. It's already happening. Now, some say it's unrealistic, idealistic that it can't happen, but I say the ones who are unrealistic are those that want to continue with the old path. That's dreaming. So in the U.S., we have more stuff than ever before, but polls show that our national happiness is actually declining. Our national happiness peaked in the 1950s, the same time that this consumption mania exploded. Interesting coincidence. I think I know why. We have more stuff, but we have less time for the things that really make us happy. Friends, family, leisure time. We're working harder than ever. Some analysts say we have less leisure time than any time since feudal society. And do you know what the two main activities are that we do with the scant leisure time we have? Watch TV and shop. In the US, we spend 3 to 4 times as many hours shopping as our counterparts in Europe do. So we're in this ridiculous situation where we go to work, maybe 2 jobs even, and we come home and we're exhausted, so we plop down on our new couch and watch TV, and the commercials tell us you suck, so you gotta go to the mall to buy something to feel better, and then you gotta go to work more to pay for the stuff you just bought, so you come home and you're more tired, so you sit down and you watch more TV, and it tells you to go to the mall again, and we're on this crazy work, watch, spend treadmill, and we could just stop. So in the end, what happens?
One reason I guess I'm quite thankful that I'm the age I am, because I was able to live to go through those changes which we all went through at that time, I think.
A decision, some unpopular decision.
We two figures. What is the tuna that you serve? Which ocean is it from and how is it caught?
As a journalist, what changed my view of the scene is when I walked into the wrong press conference in The Hague in 1990. And this was the first presentation I'd ever seen about the effect of trawling upon the seabed and upon the creatures that lived on it. And what they said was that trawling with a beam trawler was like ploughing a field 7 times a year. And I'm a farmer's son, and I thought to myself, how many crops would grow if you ploughed that field 7 times a year? And I thought not very much at all. And that changed my whole view of what was going on in the sea.
For one single number above all else, make it 2 degrees. Now everyone in the world pretty much, the European Union, big multinational corporations, Greenpeace, political parties, all agree that we have to stabilise global temperatures within 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And the reason for that is because if you cross that threshold, then there are tipping points in the Earth system which could drive the warming process essentially out of control. Huge amounts of carbon could be coming out of the world's trees and the soils, methane could be coming out of the permafrost in Siberia, and it's that extra input of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere which then leads us up the worst case scenarios to 6 or more degrees and the eventual wipeout of most of life on Earth. So our emissions have been going up between, let's say, 1950 and now. They need to level out, stabilise, and then decline just as rapidly to sustainable levels, about an 80% cut by 2050. But crucially, to keep the temperature rise within 2 degrees. This point of stabilisation needs to be at around 2015. And so that means really the timeline we've got, ticking clock, is that we have to stabilise global emissions within just 7 years from now, as we speak, 2008. And the scale of this task to achieve a transformation to a low-carbon economy for the entirety of human civilization is obviously it's a huge monumental task, probably the greatest that humanity's ever faced.
Simply, we mentioned 2 figures.
Millions of gallons of the dark poison saturate the water. This a glimpse of what the fish eat and breathe now. We're 43 miles here from the place where the oil has been spewing out of the pipe. And as you can see, he says they're doing everything they can to really
That's an absolute bomb.
This whole area absolutely stinks. It smells like petrol. And the point of this boom is to stop the oil from hitting the coastline. But all it takes is one little wave and it slurps right over. You can see the stained grass over there. And of course, this is devastating for the wild. May 27th came news that shook America. Officials concluded that 10 to 20 times more oil had been gushing out the day spent first working to protect these marshes. Efforts to stop never oil coming in waves now. She says there's no point in even trying to grow this grass. With the growing severe anger, the British finally taking its White House. This could be the biggest crisis in the Obama presidency. President Obama was playing catch up. He needed to deflect any criticisms of his role, so he let Britain get to BP. Teams of experts, he said, it was one of the only places you'll ever see this rare sea turtle. The sea turtle's lair was a drinking. Brown pelicans could barely move. Sneaking sludge. And make no mistake, hard for this is costing billion a year. They hire thousands of contractors and boats. BP's spending money on the sector runs the parish with the longest conversation here out of the Arts Monte Carlo in 20 million tours to excessive shouting. However, the White House the slums is always on the ground. Prices up. There are shuttles to her to I'm standing here at the site of the oil spill in America's history. The scale of all this and BP's progress right now is left on the lessons now that BP developed to promote the farm. And then the license to $2 million by now was $14
Go back a few thousand years, and the energy available to grow our crops or feed animals was limited by the daily sunlight falling on the earth. But now we use the energy equivalent to hundreds of years of sunlight every single year. Every part of modern life is now literally made of oil, from CDs and plastic bags to medicine and computers, from clothes and carpets to cosmetics and cell phones. It's truly a wonderful and necessary substance. Then there's our food. Each calorie we eat uses nearly 100 oil calories to produce, package, refrigerate, transport. And fossil fuel-produced fertilizers now feed a couple of billion or so people who could not otherwise be sustained. It would be prudent for humanity to carefully use the remaining oil to build a new society run without it. Instead, we're burning up tens of millions of barrels every day, so it will be gone. It will run out, leaving pretty much none for future generations, even though we in the oil industry are working our asses off looking for and finding this magical substance.
For what they have done to me.
I'm in my local electronics shop, and I've been learning that plasma TVs take 50% more energy than CRT TVs apparently. And then my engineer, what's your name, engineer? Vince, you just told me that, what did you just tell me?
Well, basically the plasmas and LCD TVs, they don't make them repairable. They're only repairable to board level, and they make it very difficult for components and any data to be had, so they can't be repaired.
So
very, very few can be repaired, and only then to board level.
So basically, you have to skip them.
Correct.
When they go wrong. Do they go wrong quickly? Are they more well made, would you say?
Well, it depends on the brands. Some of the better brands, certainly the Panasonics, are very well made and don't break down very often, but some of the LGs and Samsungs and the lesser known makes break down quite often. And
Crazy.
2 years, 3 years down the line, they're breaking.
Yeah, so you have to take them to the tip.
It's like you get to a place, somehow tapped into a space that's magic.
Popular decision, and they'd suddenly leg it and say, oh.
C'était une programmation de JanEK SCHAEFER pour l'éveil du son, une émission de la Radio Parfaite, la web radio du Printemps des Arts de Monte Carlo, en partenariat avec webSYNradio.